Hello and welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are doing something a little different. Usually we look at the surface of things, current events, modern tech, the latest trends.
Right.
But today we are effectively popping the hood on the engine of human society itself. We are looking at a text that, and I mean this quite literally, changed the way the world thinks about governments, laws, and, well, why we act the way we act.
It's one of those foundational texts, isn't it? The kind people love to cite, usually to, win an argument about the separation of powers.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But they rarely actually sit down and read it cover to cover. We are talking about Baron de Montesquieu's The Spirit of Laws, published way back in 1748.
1748. I mean, that feels like ancient history. We're talking pre-French Revolution, pre-American Revolution. But as I was going through the materials for this, the stack of notes, the excerpts, it felt surprisingly, almost uncomfortably modern. It felt like he was describing the mechanics of a clock, but the clock is us. The clock is civilization.
That's a perfect analogy, and it's one Montesquieu himself would likely appreciate.
Yeah.
He really did view the world not as just a random collection of events, but as a system, a massive interconnected machine.
And that's really the mission of this deep dive, isn't it? To try and uncover that system. Because when you look at the map, whether it's the map of 1748 or today, you see this wild diversity. You see some countries that seem to love liberty, others that seem to, I don't know, submit to tyranny without a fight. You see nations obsessed with commerce, others obsessed with war. And the big question, the one that keeps historians up at night, is just, is that random?
Exactly. Is it just a roll of the dice? Is it just bad luck that one country ends up with a dictator and another with a parliament? Or is there a code?
And Montesquieu, he thinks he cracked the code.
He does. He starts with this incredibly bold assertion right in the preface. He says, and I'm paraphrasing a bit here, I have first of all considered mankind, and the result of my thoughts has been that in such an infinite diversity of laws and manners, they were not solely conducted by the caprice of fancy.
Caprice of fancy. That's a very polite 18th century way of saying we aren't just making this up as we go along.
Precisely. He believes there are underlying rules, and this brings us right to the title, the spirit of laws. It's a very, very specific phrase. He isn't just interested in the text of the law like don't steal or pay your taxes.
The black and white letter of the law.
Right. He's interested in the relation that law has to everything else.
The context.
The context, but it's even deeper than that. He defines laws in their most extensive signification as the necessary relations derived from the nature of things.
Okay, let's stop there for a second. Necessary relations derived from the nature of things. That sounds less like a lawyer talking and, I don't know, more like a physicist.
That is exactly the vibe he is going for. Think of it like physics or geometry. He says God has laws, the material world has laws, beasts have laws, and man has laws. It's all about relationships.
So how a law relates to, say, the climate.
It's exactly.
Yeah.
To the climate, to the size of the country, to the main religion, to the type of government, that whole web of relationships. That is what he calls the spirit.
So he's basically trying to build a unified theory of sociology before sociology was even a word. He's looking for the gravity of human behavior.
Yes. If you give Montesquieu the variables, hot climate, large territory, Islamic religion, agricultural economy, he believes he can predict the laws and the government type. It's almost a mathematical approach to history. It's that systematic.
But I noticed in the intro material that this didn't exactly go over smoothly in 1748. This wasn't just a bestseller, it was a scandal.
Oh, a massive scandal. You have to remember the time. 1748, this is the Ancien Regime in France. The Catholic Church is immensely powerful. The king is absolute. And the standard explanation for why anything happens is God's will.
And here comes Montesquieu talking about necessary relations and the nature of things.
Right. And his critics, they jumped on that word necessary.
Yeah.
They claim that if laws are necessary relations, well, that implies a blind fatality ruling the world.
Spinozism. The idea that we're all just cogs in a machine.
Exactly. The charge of Spinozism or deism,
Yeah.
this idea that the universe is just a machine that God wound up and then, walked away from. If the climate determines our laws and the laws determine our behavior, where is God in that equation? And maybe more importantly, where is free will?
Right. If I'm just a product of my climate and my government type, am I actually choosing to be good or bad? Or am I just playing out a script.
That was the fear. It sounded like atheism to them. It sounded like he was removing the soul from the entire equation.
But Montesquieu fought back. I saw he wrote a whole separate book, a specific defense against these charges. How did he talk his way out of that one?
It's fascinating, actually. He argues that just because there are constant rules in the physical world doesn't mean the human world is a predetermined machine.
Hmm.
He makes this really sharp distinction between the physical world and the intelligent world.
The intelligent world being us, humans.
Us. He says the physical world, rocks, planets, the tides, it follows constant rules perfectly. A rock never decides, you know what, I'm going to float today.
Right. Gravity always wins.
Always. But the intelligent world, we don't follow our laws consistently, not even the ones we make for ourselves.
Because we're messy.
Because we are finite and prone to error. He says intelligent beings have laws they make themselves, but they also break them constantly. We are subject to ignorance, to passion, to greed. So, unlike a rock that always falls down, a human doesn't always follow the law of their own nature. We're free agents, but that freedom is exactly what leads to error.
So his defense was essentially, I'm not saying we are robots, I'm saying we are imperfect beings trying to build systems in a world that has its own set of rules.
That's it in a nutshell.
Yeah.
He says, because we're liable to forget our Creator, we have religious laws to remind us. Because we forget ourselves and our own nature, we have moral laws. And because we forget others, we have political and civil laws.
I like that. Laws aren't just arbitrary restrictions, they're reminders. They're guardrails for a species that is naturally terrible at driving.
That's a great way to put it. And once he establishes that we are building these systems to manage our own imperfections, he starts categorizing the systems themselves.
The three machines.
The three machines. Now, most of us, if we paid attention in civics class, we probably learned the Aristotelian breakdown. Monarchy, aristocracy, democracy.
Rule of one, rule of few, rule of many.
Exactly. Montesquieu looks at that and says, no, that's too simple. He rejects that classic divide. He looks at the world around him and sees three specific types of government, each with a specific nature or structure. You have the republican, the monarchical, and the despotic.
Okay, let's unpack these, because when he says Republican, he doesn't mean the GOP in the United States.
No, definitely not. It's a much broader term. For Montesquieu, a Republican government is simply one where the people, or a part of the people, have the sovereign power.
So that includes democracy, then?
Yes. If the whole people have the power, it's a democracy. If it's just a part of the people, the best families, the wealthy, the nobles, then it's an aristocracy. But he groups them both under the umbrella of republic. Okay?
Then monarchy.
A single person governs, but, and this is the crucial but, the one that separates civilization from barbarism in his eyes, they govern by fixed and established laws.
As opposed to the third machine, despotism.
Where a single person directs everything by his own will and caprice.
So the difference between a king and a tyrant isn't just how mean they are, it's not about their personality.
Not at all.
It's about paperwork.
It is about structure. It's about constraint. A king might be the ultimate authority, but he operates within a known framework. You can't just wake up one morning and seize your land because he feels like it. There are courts, there are precedents, there are established traditions. A despot, he is the law. His mood is the constitution for that day.
That is a terrifying distinction. So let's dive into the nature of these three, because he spends a lot of time on the structural requirements. Let's start with democracy. If the people hold the power, he says the laws about voting are basically the most important laws in the entire country.
Absolutely. In a democracy, suffrage is everything. The laws establishing who can vote, how they vote, who they vote for, those are fundamental. It's like the rules of a board game. If you don't define the players and how they take their turns, you don't have a game. But he has a very controversial take on how we should vote.
Yeah, this really stood out to me. He argues against the secret ballot.
He does. He argues that in a democracy, voting should be public.
Which feels totally backwards to the modern ear. We think of the secret ballot as this sacred protector of liberty. You go into the booth, you pull the curtain, and nobody knows. It stops your boss from firing you or your neighbor from judging you.
That's our modern context. But Montesquieu is looking at the sociology of the masses in, say, ancient Athens or Rome. He argues that the common people need to be guided by the prominent citizens. He thinks if you hide the vote, you lose that positive social pressure.
So he wants the elites to be able to see how the regular people vote to keep them in line.
It's actually more that he wants the regular people to see how the elites vote and to feel a sense of, shame or duty to match them. He essentially supports peer pressure as a political tool. He goes so far as to blame secret voting for the fall of the Roman Republic.
Really? How so?
He says it was no longer possible to direct a populace that sought its own destruction. His point is that when the votes became secret, the mob could be bought or swayed by a charismatic demagogue without any public shame. There was no accountability.
Wow, so he thinks the average Joe needs to be seen by the elites to keep them honest. That is not very democratic by our modern standards.
It's not. But Montesquieu has a very specific view of the people's capabilities. He trusts the people to choose, but he doesn't trust them to manage.
What's the distinction there?
He says people are great at choosing generals. Why? Because you can see the results. Did the general win the battle? Yes or no? Did the magistrate build the aqueduct? Yes or no? The people are good at judging tangible outcomes.
But are they capable of actually running the government?
He says absolutely not. The day-to-day negotiation, the intricate policy-making, the foresight needed, he thinks that's beyond them. He has this vivid, almost cruel image. Sometimes with 100,000 arms, they overturn all before them, and sometimes with 100,000 feet, they creep like insects.
Creep like insects. That is harsh.
It is. He sees the mass of people as incredibly volatile. They're either an unstoppable, destructive force or a paralyzed, useless mess. They need structure imposed on them.
Okay, let's move to the second type of republic, aristocracy, the rule of the few.
The few govern the many. And here, Montesquieu is very pragmatic. He says the best aristocracy is the one that tries its hardest to look like a democracy.
Fake it till you make it.
Sort of, yeah. He says the more an aristocracy borders on democracy, the more perfect it is. If the noble families live simply, if they mix with the people, if they don't constantly flaunt their power and privilege, the system can be stable. The worst form is when the nobles are clearly the masters, and the people are, for all intents and purposes, slaves.
He points to Poland at his time as the tragic example of this, right?
Yes, exactly, where the peasants were essentially the property of the nobility. That, for Montesquieu, is a broken machine. It's an aristocracy that has forgotten its nature and is teetering on the edge of becoming something much worse.
Okay, moving to the monarchy. This is one person ruling with laws. But he says a monarchy needs more than just a king and a law book. It needs what he calls intermediate powers.
This is one of the most famous, most influential parts of the entire book. His great maxim, no monarch, no nobility, no nobility, no monarch.
What does he mean by that?
He means that if you remove the nobility, the clergy, the independent cities, all those layers of power and privilege between the king and the common people, you don't get a freer state. You get a despot.
Because there's nothing to buffer the power.
Precisely. The nobility acts as a channel. Think of a river. Think of a river. The king's power is the water. The nobility are the banks, the rocks, the bends in the river. They slow it down. They direct its flow. Without them, the water just crashes down in a flood and destroys the whole valley.
It's interesting. He even defends the church here. And we know Montesquieu was an Enlightenment thinker. He wasn't exactly a devout zealot.
Far from it. But he defends the church's political role. He says in a monarchy, ecclesiastical power is a necessary barrier. It stops the king from becoming a tyrant. If the king respects nothing else, he might respect the power of the bishop or the archbishop. And that gives the people a little bit of breathing room.
That brings us to the third machine, despotism. This just sounds like the absolute nightmare scenario.
It is the nightmare. The nature of despotism is that a single person rules by will alone. But Montesquieu points out a fascinating structural flaw, or maybe it's a feature. The fundamental law of despotism is that the tyrant almost never actually rules.
Wait, what? If he's the absolute ruler, how does he not rule?
He appoints a vizier.
A vizier.
Like an Aladdin
And
show.
Farah. Exactly like that. Montesquieu argues that there is a psychological inevitability to despotism. Imagine a man who is told from birth that his every whim is law. He is surrounded by people telling him he is everything and they are nothing. He has unlimited, immediate access to any pleasure he can imagine. What happens to that man's brain?
He gets lazy. And probably pretty weird.
He becomes naturally lazy, voluptuous, and ignorant. Why would you bother with a tedious business of statecraft? He abandons business for pleasure. He retreats into the seraglio, the harem. He locks himself away with his concubines and his wine.
So he hires a manager to run the country. He hires a vizier to do the dirty work. And Montesquieu says the more extensive the empire, the larger the seraglio, and the more obsessed with pleasure the prince is, the less he cares about government and the more powerful the vizier becomes.
So it's a system designed to rot from the head down. The guy at the top is partying, and the guy actually running the show is a brutal bureaucrat just trying to keep his own head on his shoulders.
Precisely. And because the vizier serves entirely at the whim of the prince, The vizier has to be absolutely brutal to keep his job. It's a cascade of terror from the top all the way down.
So we have the three machines: republic, monarchy, despotism. That's the structure, that's the hardware. But then Montesquieu introduces this other concept, what you call the engine room, or what he calls the principles.
Yes, this is a crucial distinction, and it's where a lot of readers get lost. The nature is what the government is, its physical structure. The principle is the human passion that makes it act.
He uses that watch analogy, right? The nature is the wheels and cogs. The principle is the mainspring.
Correct. You can have the gears perfectly aligned, the most beautiful watch case in the world, but if the spring is breaking, the watch doesn't move.
Yeah.
Each government, he says, is powered by a very specific human passion. And if that passion dies, the government fails, even if the structure is still there.
All right, let's run through the springs. What powers a democracy?
Virtue.
Virtue. Now, we need to be really careful here. He defines this very specifically. He doesn't mean moral virtue in the sense of, being a faithful husband or a charitable neighbor.
Right. It is not Christian moral virtue. It is political virtue.
Right.
It is specifically the love of the republic and, even more importantly, the love of equality.
Why is that the spring? Why does a democracy need virtue more than, say, a monarchy?
Well, think about the enforcement mechanism. In a monarchy, if you break the law, who comes for you?
The king's guards, the police, some external force.
Right. The law has the prince's arm to enforce it. But in a republic, the citizens are the state. They are the executioners of the law. If I see you breaking the law, it is my job as a citizen to hold you accountable and vice versa.
And if we're all corrupt, if we all just look the other way,
Then the system collapses instantly. If the citizens themselves are the ones breaking the rules, who is left to enforce them?
the inmates are running the asylum.
Precisely. If the people lose that love of equality, if they lose that self-restraint and that desire to put the public good first, the state falls apart from the inside. He gives the example of Athens.
A tale of two Athens.
He says Athens had 20,000 citizens when it stood up to the mighty Persian Empire and won. It was a small, scrappy, virtuous state. It achieved the impossible. Generations later, under Demetrius of Phalerum, a census showed it had the same number, 20,000 citizens. But by then, they were enslaved.
Same number of people, totally different result.
Because the principle was gone. The spring was broken. They had lost their virtue. They wanted the freedom to be corrupt, the freedom to get rich, not the freedom of the citizen. They wanted the luxury of a monarch without the chains. But you can't have it both ways.
Okay, so democracy runs on virtue. What about aristocracy?
Moderation. The nobles have to restrain themselves. If they flaunt their wealth too much or oppress the people too hard, the people will eventually revolt. If they fight amongst themselves too much for power, they'll destroy the state from within. They have to keep a low profile. It's a kind of a boring virtue, but a necessary one.
And monarchy, this was the one that really surprised me because I would have expected him to say something like loyalty or duty.
Yes, and this is probably Montesquieu's most provocative idea. He says virtue is not necessary in a monarchy.
That seems incredibly cynical.
It is clinically observational. He's not saying it's good or bad, just that is how the machine works. He says the state survives perfectly well without it. Instead of virtue, the spring of monarchy is honor, the prejudice of every person in rank. It's the desire for distinction, for glory, for a higher rank. In a monarchy, people do great things not because they love their country, but because they want glory for themselves. They want the title, the medal, the promotion, the invitation to the king's ball.
So it's ego, ambition.
It is ego, harnessed for the public good. He basically describes an invisible hand effect, though he doesn't use that exact phrase. The concept is clearly there. He says each individual advances the public good while he only thinks of promoting his own interest.
That is fascinating. So the king dangles a medal, and people will go die on a battlefield to get that medal, and in the process, the kingdom is defended.
Exactly. Virtue is about self-sacrifice for the whole. Honor is about self-promotion within a hierarchy. But in the end, they both get the job done. And honor has its own bizarre set of rules. It allows for gallantry. It allows for cunning. It even allows for, sucking up to your superiors. But it absolutely forbids anything that looks like cowardice.
You can be a snake, but you can't be a chicken.
Exactly. You can be a schemer, but you cannot be seen to be subservient to a rank lower than yourself. It creates a very specific type of society, one that is completely obsessed with rank, reputation, and appearance.
That brings us to the last one, despotism. If democracy is virtue and monarchy is honor, what in the world powers the despot's state? Just fear. That's it.
Pure, unadulterated fear. That's the only spring. Honor is actually dangerous in a despotism because people with a sense of honor might rebel. A person with honor might say, I refuse to kill that innocent man. It is beneath me. The despot cannot have that.
And virtue is just irrelevant.
Virtue is way too much work.
Yeah.
Why bother cultivating virtue when you can just threaten to kill someone? The only thing that keeps the machine moving is the constantly uplifted arm of the prince. If he pauses, if he shows a moment of weakness, the whole system collapses into chaos.
He paints a really terrifying picture of the kind of obedience this requires.
He does. He says in a despotic state, man is a creature that obeys a creature that wants. There is no arguing. There are no excuses. You can't say, I can't come to the palace today. I'm sick. You can't say, but sire, that's my father.
No filial respect.
None. The order is given. The order is executed. The state devours the family. The only exception, and this is a really interesting nuance Montesquieu finds, is religion.
Religion.
Yes. Montesquieu observes that in these Eastern despotisms he studies, places like the Ottoman Empire or Persia religion is a force that is sometimes even higher than the Sultan or the Shah. A subject will kill their own father if the Sultan orders it, but they won't drink wine for him if their religion forbids it.
So religion is the only check on that absolute power.
It's the only wall the despot can't easily knock down. It's the one area where the subject might finally say no.
So we have the three machines and their springs: virtue, moderation, honor, fear. But Montesquieu doesn't stop there. He says you actually have to design the citizens to fit the machine. This is where we get into education.
Right. And for him, education isn't just about reading and writing and arithmetic. It's about molding the passions. You have to mold the mind of the child to fit the government they're going to live under.
So how do you educate a monarchist?
Well, you don't really do it in school. Montesquieu says in a monarchy, real education happens in the world. It happens at court, in the salons, in the military, in the whole social scene. And it teaches you three main things: a certain nobleness in your virtues, a certain frankness in your morals, and a certain politeness in your behavior.
But he's pretty cynical about this frankness, isn't he? It's not about honesty.
Not at all. He says you are taught to be frank, not because truth is inherently good, but because being bold and outspoken makes you look free and noble. It's a power move. You speak your mind to show you aren't afraid.
And the politeness?
He says that politeness is actually just pride in disguise.
Yeah.
You are polite to show that you aren't a peasant. You hold the door open, not necessarily to help the other person, but to demonstrate that you are the kind of person who knows the proper way to hold a door. It's all about surface and status.
So it's all about reinforcing the hierarchy and your place in it.
Exactly. Whereas in a despotism, education is brutally simple. Its goal is to break the spirit. To make a good slave, you have to take everything away. Ignorance isn't an accident, it's a tool of the state. He has this chilling line: every tyrant is at the same time a slave.
Meaning
Meaning the tyrant himself is enslaved by his own paranoia and by the brutal system he created. The education must be servile. You crush the spirit of the child so they never even think to rebel.
And the Republic.
That is the hardest job of all. Education in a republic must inspire self-renunciation.
Which goes completely against human nature.
Completely. We are naturally selfish creatures. We want to keep our money, we want to maximize our own comfort. But a republic demands that you prefer the public good to your own. That requires constant, intense reinforcement, starting from birth.
He brings up the role of fathers here, which is interesting.
Yes. He says if the young generation becomes corrupt, it is not their fault. It's because the old were already corrupted. The parents have to set the example. The family is the incubator of virtue. If that incubator is broken, the citizen comes out broken.
Speaking of education and molding minds, there is this really weird but fascinating section about music. The Greek paradox.
Ah, yes. This is one of my favorite little tangents in the whole book.
He says the ancient Greeks thought music was a political necessity. Why? I mean, it seems so trivial compared to, laws and armies.
Well, you have to understand who the Greeks were in his telling. Montesquieu describes them as a nation of wrestlers and warriors. Their education was almost entirely physical, military, and harsh. It was designed to make them fierce.
Hardened.
Exactly. So they needed a counterbalance. They needed something to soften their manners, to awaken what he calls lenity and pity. If they didn't have music, their brutal military education would have turned them into complete savages.
So music wasn't just entertainment, it was a civilizing force. It was therapy for an entire culture.
It was the medium between the physical exercises of the gymnasium and the harsh reality of the battlefield. He points out that Plato and Aristotle disagreed on almost everything. politics, metaphysics, the soul. But they both agreed on this one point. If you change the music, you change the Constitution.
That is wild. It's like saying if a country switches from listening to classical music to heavy metal, you destabilize the government.
In their view, yes, because you are changing the soul or the manners of the people. And manners are the invisible glue that holds the laws together. If the people become too rough, or for that matter, too soft, the laws stop working because they no longer fit the character of the citizenry.
So we've built the machine, we've fueled it with the right principle, we've educated the citizens. Now we actually have to write the laws. And Montesquieu's whole point is you can't just copy-paste laws from one country to another. They have to be tailored to the principle.
Exactly. Let's look at legislating for a republic. If the principle is equality and virtue, then the laws must actively force equality.
This sounded almost communist in some parts, or at least radically redistributive.
It creates a very specific economic structure. He says you must legislate frugality. If wealth becomes too unequal, happiness becomes unequal, and that love of the republic just dies. The rich start thinking they're above the law, and the poor stop caring about a state that does nothing for them.
So how do you legislate that? How do you force people to be equal?
Through things like inheritance laws. He talks about strictly limiting the size of dowries. And he mentions this specific radical rule from an ancient Greek law. A father can only choose one heir.
One heir. What happens to the other kids?
They must be adopted by citizens who are poor and have no children.
Whoa. So you literally redistribute the children to balance the population and the wealth.
It's extreme, but you can see the logic. You cannot allow great families to accumulate massive wealth over generations. You have to constantly hit the reset button to keep citizens on a somewhat equal footing. It's social engineering on a massive scale.
And for monarchies, it's the complete opposite.
The complete opposite. In a monarchy, you want the great families to keep their wealth. You need the nobility to be powerful and permanent. So you have laws of primogeniture. The eldest son gets everything.
To keep the estate intact and powerful.
Exactly. You have rights of redemption, which allowed noble families to buy back land they had sold. You want these massive, powerful dynasties because they act as the essential counterweight to the king.
He also mentioned something interesting about the speed of government in a monarchy.
Yes. He says monarchies are naturally faster than republics because one person is making the decisions. We attack at dawn. It's done. But that speed can be incredibly dangerous, so the laws must be designed to slow things down.
So red tape is a feature, not a bug.
It is. He says the complexity of laws, the formalities, the tribunals, the lawyers arguing back and forth, they are all necessary to prevent the prince from acting rashly on a whim. It's a buffer against tyranny.
So when we complain about bureaucracy taking forever, Montesquieu would say, be thankful that bureaucracy is what's keeping you safe from the king.
Precisely. It's the price of liberty under a monarch.
And for despotism, what are the laws like there?
Simplicity itself. Train the horse, don't change the rider. You don't need complex laws when the only rule is do what I say or you die.
He mentions that land ownership in a despotism is a complete disaster.
Because the prince owns everything. If the prince owns all the land, no one builds for the future, no one plants trees, no one improves the soil. Why would you? It could all be taken away from you tomorrow. So the state becomes a desert. He has this awful line, something like, it is better for the despot to reign over a desert than over a rebellious people.
He used a specific historical anecdote about Charles XII of Sweden to illustrate this despotic mindset.
Yes, the famous boot story. It's perfect.
Tell us about the boot.
So Charles XII is in exile in Bender in the Ottoman Empire. He's miles away from Sweden.
Yeah.
And the Senate back home is giving him some trouble. They aren't doing exactly what he wants. So he writes them a letter and says he's going to send one of his boots to command them.
His actual leather boot.
His boot. And Montesquieu's punchline is, this boot would have governed like a despotic prince. That is the essence of it. Despotism doesn't require a mind. It doesn't require negotiation or wisdom. It just requires an object of fear. A boot can rule just as well as a man, as long as people are afraid of what the boot represents.
Moving on to criminal justice. This is where I really felt the connection to our modern debates about legal systems, about fairness versus efficiency.
Montesquieu is very, very strong here. He draws a direct line between liberty and complexity.
Explain that. That seems counterintuitive.
He says that in free states, so in republics and monarchies, the laws are necessarily complex. Trials are long. There are witnesses, defenses, appeals, jury selections, all these formalities.
Which, let's be honest, we often complain about. The wheels of justice turn so slow.
But Montesquieu says that slowness is the price of liberty. That complexity is what protects your property, your honor, and your life. If you want speed, he says, go to Turkey.
Where the pasha bashes your feet.
That's his example. He says decisions in the Ottoman lands are fast. The pasha listens for 5 minutes, has the feet of the litigants beaten with a stick, and sends them home. No appeal, no delay.
Efficient, I guess.
Very. But no one is safe. You can lose everything you own in 5 minutes because the judge is having a bad day. He says the pasha bashes the feet of the litigants and sends them home. End of trial. That's it.
He also talks about who should be the judge in these systems.
In a republic, it should be the people juries of one's peers. In a despotism, the prince is the law and the judge. But in a monarchy, he says the prince must never judge personally. It's a fatal mistake.
Why not? He's the king. Shouldn't he be the ultimate judge?
Because if the king judges, he is acting as both the prosecutor and the judge. He's the one offended by the crime, and he is also the one deciding the punishment. He loses what Montesquieu calls the most beautiful attribute of sovereignty, the power of pardoning.
The power to grant mercy.
Exactly. The king's role is to be the source of mercy. If he is the one condemning you to death, he can't then turn around and pardon you without looking weak or schizophrenic. He has to stay above the messy business of condemnation.
Then we get to the punishments themselves. This section was heavy.
It is the section on the severity of punishments. And his core thesis is simple. Moderate governments use mild punishments. Despotic ones use terror.
He brings up Japan as his main case study, and the descriptions are just, death for gambling, death for lying.
It's horrific.
Yeah.
And he asks why. Why are the laws of Japan so uniquely violent?
Yeah.
He concludes it is because the emperor is considered to be like a god on earth.
So a crime isn't just a crime against society, it's a sin against a deity.
It's high treason against God. If you lie, you are lying to God. Therefore, you deserve death. But then he asks the crucial question, does it work?
And Montesquieu says a resounding no.
He says the excessive severity of the laws hinders their execution.
What does he mean? That people just stop enforcing them?
Exactly. This is a crucial psychological insight. If the penalty for a small theft is death, a kind neighbor won't report it. A judge will look for any loophole to acquit. The system jams up because the punishment is too extreme for human nature to tolerate. It creates a culture of either brutality or chaos, with no middle ground.
He tells that absolutely heartbreaking story about mothers in the seraglio.
Yes, mothers suffocating their own newborn babies to save them from the cruelty and political horrors of the seraglio. When the laws are too harsh, human nature rebels in the most awful ways. You force people to do the unthinkable just to escape the unbearable.
He has a line, shame should be the scourge, not pain.
Yes. In a moderate government, in a republic or a monarchy, the fear of losing your reputation is enough to keep most people in line. If you are convicted of a crime, you lose your standing in the community. That hurts more than a whipping. But in a despotism.
People have no honor to lose in the first place.
Exactly. Everyone is already a slave. So the only tool the state has left is physical pain. But eventually people get hardened to it. You can't govern by force alone forever. The ruler's arm gets tired.
Let's switch gears to something a bit more material, luxury. And tied into that, the condition of women.
These two are deeply linked for Montesquieu. They're part of the same social fabric.
He breaks down luxury almost like a math equation.
He does. He says luxury is in a compound proportion to the inequality of fortunes. If everyone has the same amount of money, luxury is zero. If one person has double what another has, luxury begins. He buys a slightly nicer coat. If he has 1,000 times more, he buys a palace.
And again, the advice on whether luxury is good or bad depends entirely on the government type.
In a republic, luxury is fatal. It's poison. It shatters that love of equality, which is the spring of the whole machine. If I have gold shoes and you don't, we aren't equal citizens anymore. I start to think I'm better than you. The wealthy turn against the very laws that confine them.
But in monarchy,
In a monarchy, luxury is necessary. He has this famous phrase, if the rich do not spend, the poor die.
it sounds a lot like trickle-down economics.
In a way, it is. In a monarchy, wealth is unequal by design. That's the system. So the rich must spend their fortunes to circulate that wealth back down to the artisans, the merchants, the servants. The capital city grows. People try to distinguish themselves with trifles. It's what keeps the whole economy moving.
And in despotism,
Luxury exists, of course, but he calls it the abuse of servitude. It's a slave utilizing the labor of other slaves. It's not about economic circulation. It's about momentary, desperate pleasure in a dangerous world. Let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. That's the luxury of a despotism.
And how do women fit into this picture?
Montesquieu uses the status and freedom of women as a kind of barometer for the society, a litmus test.
How so?
Well, in republics, women are free by law. They aren't slaves, but they are, in his words, captive by manners.
Captive by manners. What does that mean?
It means the culture demands strict chastity, modesty, and gravity. He mentions the old Roman domestic tribunals where the male relatives would literally sit as a court and judge the wife's conduct. Because the republic relies on virtue and the family's the school of virtue, women, in his 18th century view, had to be the guardians of that morality.
Okay. And in monarchies?
The complete opposite.
Yes.
Women are the center of the court. They have very little restraint. They use their charms, their wit, their influence to advance their family's fortunes. Luxury attends them. They are powerful players in the great game of honor and status.
And despotism is the grim conclusion.
Objects. Strict servitude. The harem. He says a quarrel in a harem, a dispute between two wives, could destabilize the entire state, so they are locked away from the world. They are objects of luxury, not participants in society.
So we've toured the whole building. We've seen the foundations, the engines, the schools, the courts, and even the living rooms. What is the big takeaway here? What's the spirit of laws?
The takeaway is the connectedness. That's the absolute genius of the book. You cannot just change one thing.
You can't just swap out a law you don't like for another one.
No. You cannot say, I really like the education system of a republic, but I want the luxury of a monarchy and the fast justice of a despotism. Montesquieu is screaming across the centuries that these systems are interconnected webs. You cannot change the inheritance laws without fundamentally affecting the principle of the government.
And this leads directly to his final and most important warning about corruption.
Yes. Corruption for him doesn't start with a bad law. It starts when the principle rots.
When the spring breaks.
Exactly. When a democracy loses its virtue, when people stop loving equality and start wanting the luxury and power of a monarch, the republic dies from within. When a monarchy loses its sense of honor, when the nobles stop being a proud check on the king and become his servile slaves, it slides inevitably into despotism.
It always seems to slide toward despotism, doesn't it? That seems to be the default state, the gravity well.
It is the easiest form of government to establish and the hardest to escape. It requires only base passions. A moderate government, he says, requires a delicate balance, tension, what he calls ballast. It is a masterpiece of legislation. Despotism is just force.
Which brings us to the final thought. We live in a world that is obsessed with efficiency. We want fast trials. We want decisive leaders. We want simple, clear answers to complex problems.
Now, Montesquieu is raising a giant red flag across the centuries. He suggests that liberty isn't about having the fewest laws or the fastest government or the simplest system. Liberty is about having the right complications.
Friction.
Friction, the friction of the nobility against the king, the friction of the judiciary against the prosecutor, the friction of the citizen against their own selfish impulse to be corrupt, the checks and balances.
Are we, in our modern quest for efficiency and fast justice, accidentally removing the very friction that keeps us free?
That is the question the spirit of laws leaves us with, and it is one we should probably ask ourselves every single day.
A lot to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Montesquieu.
It was my pleasure.
And thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.